1980. What a way to kick off such an important decade of music. We had Back in Black, we had Permanent Waves, we had Ace of Spades, classic albums that would influence rock and rollers for many decades. But I'd argue none are as important as the almighty Iron Maiden. Yes, everyone, this is Monkey Sensei back with another video, another episode of my series, Meditation Through Vinyl. And today, as you can already tell by the thumbnail, I'll be talking about the amazing debut record by English band Iron Maiden. These guys really spearheaded the whole new wave of British heavy metal movement. You could argue Judas Priest had dabbled a little bit in the 70s, which they did. They were really the first influences of that. But Iron Maiden were really the first band to really kick off that whole new album movement. And this album definitely influenced a lot of bands to come. Again, this is their debut album from 1980. It's got Paul Di'Anno on vocals. You have Steve Harris on bass, who actually formed the band in 1975. You got Dennis Stratton, who is actually this is the only album to feature Dennis Stratton, actually. Dave Murray, who's still with the band to this day, and Clive Burr on drums, who I think is a very underrated drummer in my opinion. He is really great on this album. And as a side note, if you check out the BBC sessions, there's a version of the title track of this album, Iron Maiden, where he's just doing drum fills and in between the verses, it's just chef's kiss. It's amazing. Especially if you have headphones on, you can really hear the drums pounding on this. But this album from 1980, just a classic metal album. And I actually happen to own the Parlophone version, remastered version from 2014, which sounds fantastic. This is the first album with Paul Di'Anno on vocals, who in my opinion is maybe not the best vocalist, but for the kind of music they were doing on this album, his voice is perfect. For the first two records, this one and Killers, he was perfect on. And in my opinion, I actually prefer the Di'Anno era of Maiden over the Bruce Dickinson era. Now, it's hard to compare because there's only two records with Di'Anno, and Bruce obviously had about 12 or 15, however many, with the group. But for the purposes of the punkiness, the progressive, the metallic nature of what they were doing on this record, Paul Di'Anno is the perfect guy for the job. And he's my favorite Maiden vocalist personally. Now, a lot of people will say that Bruce Dickinson is their favorite. And again, I love the Bruce Dickinson era. Later on in this channel, I plan on reviewing a bunch of Maiden albums from that classic period of Maiden from 82 to 88. Which I'd say actually, I'd argue, goes up to 92. But I digress on that. But for the moment, I'm talking about the classic 1980 album, self-titled debut. And man, what a record it is. As soon as you put it on, you hear the amazing riffage of Prowler. It's this kind of dark, distorted metal riff. And then the drums kick in. And you hear Paul Di'Anno's raspy voice kick in. And it's just, this is a totally different sound than what was going on in the 70s. This is a combination of punk, metal, and as you find out with some of the other tracks, a little bit of progressiveness too, a little bit of proggy sounds blending in there. And I know Steve Harris hates to say that Maiden were kind of a punk band, but if you listen to this album and a little bit of Killers, you could definitely hear that punk nature in their sound. Really no getting around that. I think that's one of the reasons why Steve Harris doesn't really like this album as much, because mainly the production, which is a little bit lo-fi compared to what would be going on later on, what you hear later on in their music, and because again the songs are more on a little more simple. And of course you have the amazing Martin Birch producing their records from then on out up until Fear of the Dark, actually. Yeah, Fear of the Dark was the last record that Martin Birch produced for them. That's why all those 80s albums sound as great as they do from Martin Birch. And then from Prowler, you get into Remember Tomorrow. Really a showcase of Paul Di'Anno's amazing vocal abilities. Yeah, he can hit the high notes. Yeah, he can sing really loud and strong, but he also has a really nice baritone in his voice on the slower songs. To me, the slower songs really showcase Paul Di'Anno's abilities as a singer, almost more so than the faster, heavy songs. And then from then, you get into the amazing Running Free, which is really a showcase for that more punk vibe that they were going on this record. Running Free, you just start with that simple Clyburn drum beat. And you got that little riff that goes on, and then Paul Di'Anno is just singing. He sings about running free. Just being 16, having no money, just going off and doing your own thing, running away from the police. It's an excellent, excellent little song. And one of the songs that they still play live, even with the Bruce Dickinson lineup. They play that song live, Wrathchild. They play the title track all the time. That closed out all their concerts. They had to play that. I mean, it's Iron Maiden, for God's sake, which I'm going to get into that track later on. But Running Free is amazing. And then Phantom of the Opera. This is one of the first cases of a more progressive-leaning song for them. It has waves and valleys, just like Remember Tomorrow. Has that heavy, heavy part towards the middle and the end. But Transylvania, what a song this is. Just the way Di'Anno sings on Phantom of the Opera, you can really hear that operatic thing they were going for on the track. It's very, again, very progressive, very heavy. The solos on it are amazing. It's really the first instances, this whole album is really the first instance of that dual lead kind of sound that Judas Priest were doing in the 70s. But Iron Maiden, in my opinion, really perfect that, especially on the second record. But it really starts getting showcased on this album with Dennis Stratton and Dave Murray. Just trading solos and leads is just a wonderful blend of guitar tones. And then you flip the record over and you get the amazing instrumental Transylvania. This is another progressive, trippy, kind of heavy instrumental track. I love it when you put this on because you think, oh, if you don't know any better, you think, oh, there's going to be some singing at some point. But it just kind of flows. It's almost like La Via Strangiata from Rush. It just kind of flows. You don't need any vocals. It's just perfect as an instrumental track. Which leads into the amazing Strange World. You don't even notice, when I listen to this on the turntable, I don't even notice the two tracks blend together so perfectly. I just hear that little distant little cymbal hits and spooky atmospheric guitar licks that are in the song. And then you start hearing Di'Anno sing on Strange World, and you're like, oh, it's a new song. Okay, we're in a new song now. It's just so seamless the way those tracks flow together. And I love it for that. Another softer track to really display Paul Di'Anno's amazing vocal abilities and why I think he's my favorite, my Maiden vocalist. And then when that song gets over, you get to the really cool, really punky vibe of Charlotte the Harlot. This is another favorite of mine on the record. It's just heavy, punky, just classic 80s Maiden, without a doubt. Just great through and through. And then, to end the record off, you get the amazing title track, Iron Maiden. And if anyone were to deny that this album is a punk record, at least in some degree, I'd tell them to listen to this title track. Because this title track is a fast, punky track. It is balls to the wall, just heavy, fast. Paul Di'Anno is doing these high-pitched vocals on it, like he did on Prowler and Running Free, and a lot of this record. He's just screaming up a storm, and it's just amazing. He really services that punk vibe that they were going for on this record. Just the speed of the song, the vocals, the drumming, the solo towards the middle there. It's just, it's fantastic just hearing that. What a kick-ass way to close out your fucking album than with a title track so great. I'd argue, as much as I love Killers, I'd argue that this title track that closes this album is better than Drifter. And I love Drifter too from Killers. But I think that this album closes way stronger than Killers. Even though I prefer Killers as an overall piece of an album. And yes, I will talk about Killers at another point in time. But I really want to talk about this album first. Because this album just influenced so many people. And I think because I love the Di'Anno era so much, it really influenced me loving most of the early Maiden catalog up until like the early 90s and even up to some of the newer, more progressive music that they've been doing really lately, like Brave New World and Senjutsu and all those later albums with Kevin Shirley. But if it wasn't for the Di'Anno era, I don't think I'd be much of a Maiden fan as I am, because I just love those first two records. And it's really a good gateway to get into Maiden, just with how accessible the songs are. This isn't Peace of Mind, this isn't Power Slave. You know, those albums are fantastic as well. Some of my favorite metal albums of all time. But I always tell people, if you want to get into Maiden, and if you really like more of a punky vibe to your metal, start with this record. Please start with the first Maiden album, because it is a kick-ass metal album. Start to finish, not a bad song on here. No filler, all killer, just a great record. And of course, Derek Riggs did the cover of this album too. Classic cover. Got to mention that earlier. Cover is great. Back cover is fantastic. Just some amazing live shots. Di'Anno there. Yeah, Di'Anno there. Just ripping up a storm. I love this smoky photo of Steve Harris and Di'Anno. Just excellent stuff. Excellent early 80s progressive punk metal blend. That a lot of bands, they do it, but they usually go way too overboard. Maiden themselves are kind of, I'd say, victims of this. They go overboard and do like these 80-minute long records, which, you know, I can enjoy it, but I can't listen to it all the time. This is an album I can listen to all the time, front to back, because it's shorter, it's to the point, and it just kicks ass all the way through. So if anyone wants to get into Maiden, I would always recommend starting off with this album. Start with the Paul Di'Anno era. And if you want to buy his album on vinyl, I would recommend getting the 2014 Parlophone reissues if you can find them. They're getting hard to find now, along with everything that's hard to find now, with all the, the pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world. But if you can get a hold of these Parlophone versions, I mean, literally, there was the label the Beatles were on in the UK, so you know it's going to sound great. These were remastered, I believe, at Abbey Road Studios, actually, from the original master tapes. Which I love when people do that. Like when they reproduce the album, when they remaster it from the original analog tape, and they put it on vinyl. That's the way vinyl is supposed to be. Which, in order to be able to get this, as a side note, in order to be able to get this record to sound as good as they did, they had to put the master tape, because it was so old, they had to put the master tape in the oven. And it's like a giant oven to heat up the glue, so you could run the tape through the machine again. That's the process that a lot of record companies and studios have to do nowadays to be able to get the master tapes to work. And again, these records are kind of pricey, like, $25, $30, but they are so totally worth it. So totally worth it. Because I had an American copy, I believe it's from In Groove, that was like, $20. And it's 2015 reissues. And I bought that from one of my local record stores a long time ago. But I listened to that, and it sounded like straight garbage. The instruments were way too loud. Di'Anno's vocals were buried way into the mix. It's just, I don't know, those In Groove, I believe those are also digitally sourced copies too, pressings, I should say, which are hit or miss. When Led Zeppelin and Jimmy Page do it, it sounds great. But when they did it for Iron Maiden, I feel like they cut corners and it just doesn't sound as good. So if you can find them, I would spring for the 2014 Parlophone reissues. They sound fantastic, and they're worth every single penny, I can assure you. Put this record on and start blasting some Maiden. And with all that, I'd like to thank you guys for watching my review of the very first Iron Maiden album. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, comment down below, and let me know your thoughts on Iron Maiden, especially this kick-ass debut album. Please, let's get a discussion going. And with all that, make sure to keep meditating through vinyl.